our next story, we fast forwarded nearly 2,000 years to someone a little more current. I'll kick this story off with a personal quote.
I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best.
Whoa, atheist much? Believe it or not, that was from C.S. Lewis. He was writing to a Christian friend he'd known since childhood. And to highlight just how dramatic his conversion was, here's another quote from a letter he wrote to the same friend 15 years later.
Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection.
Conversion? Check. Dramatic? Check again. Like Paul, it seemed impossible. But unlike Paul, the conversion of C.S. Lewis was definitely not the instantaneous light from heaven event. His conversion took place over the course of 15 years. But first, some background. Clive Staples Lewis was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1898. The Lewises were a wealthy family who went to church, nominally Anglican like most of England. At 10 years old, the bottom dropped out of Lewis's world. His desperate prayers seemed to fall on deaf ears when his mother died of cancer. Looking back, Lewis had this to say.
The trouble with God is that he is like a person who never acknowledges one's letters, and so, in time, one comes to the conclusion either that he does not exist, or that you have got the address wrong.
Boarding school is where this drift from God really started to gain momentum. He was deeply influenced by his academic training in classical literature and philosophy. He saw Christianity as an outdated and superstitious belief system. Atheism was beginning to set in, and by 16, he describes his own atheism as fully formed. Lewis went on to Oxford in 1916 to study classics and philosophy. However, his studies were interrupted by World War I, where he was commissioned as an officer in the British Army. Lewis's fellow soldier was a man named Paddy Moore. Lewis and Moore made a pact. If either of them were killed in action, the survivor would look after the family of the other. A few months later, 18-year-old Paddy Moore was killed. Lewis was devastated, and the loss had a profound effect on him for the rest of his life. In his book, Surprised by Joy, he wrote about the despair and disillusionment he felt at the time, and his resistance to God was more solid than ever.
I never sank so low as to pray.
Atheism was cemented. He believed that science left no room for God. Religion? Religion was oppressive. Later, Lewis returned to Oxford to complete his studies and eventually became a fellow and tutor in English literature at Magdalen College, Oxford. Reflecting on his atheist years, he had this to say in a radio program on the BBC.
Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, "Why do you not believe in God?" my reply would have run something like this. If you ask me to believe that the universe is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit.
Oxford has produced thinkers on both sides of the God issue. Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, Stephen Hawking are some notable members of Team Atheist. N.T. Wright, John Lennox, and Tim Keller, Team Christian. But here's Lewis on Team Atheist, and he's considering switching teams? Impossible. Chalk it up to another close friend of his on Team Christian who spoke Elvish. We'll meet him, but first, the writings of G.K. Chesterton. Considered an original voice of the early 20th century, Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, challenged Lewis's atheism and opened Lewis's mind to the possibility of the truth of Christianity. Lewis wrote this.
My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line.
Simple, yet so profound. And it seems God was engaged with the slow, plodding pace of this brilliant mind who had experienced so much life trauma. Okay, so back to his Lord of the Ring loving Oxford buddy. J.R.R. Tolkien was a fellow professor of English and a devout Catholic. The two shared deep, meaningful discussions about religion and spirituality, and of course, lions, wardrobes, and hobbits. In Tolkien, Lewis was exposed to an intellectually rigorous form of Christianity. He began to see that faith could be reconciled with reason and science. Seeds of belief were planted in Lewis's mind. He even had this to say.
People often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I don't think that is the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into either a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself.
Lewis's conversion was no flash of light, but rather a slow and gradual process. He wrote that he was initially drawn to Christianity because of its moral and ethical teachings, which he found to be both compelling and practical. However, as he continued to read and reflect on the Christian faith, he came to see that it offered a profound and satisfying explanation for the world and human existence. C.S. Lewis referred to himself as a most reluctant convert to faith, which speaks to his spiritual honesty and integrity. He understood that embracing Christian faith would have a profound and lasting impact on his life, and he approached the decision with care and consideration. When he finally made the decision to commit, he did so with a full and complete surrender of his will, embracing the faith with his entire being, his heart, mind, and soul. Before long, people began to take notice of his insights and deep thinking on the Christian faith, so much so that in 1941, the BBC came calling. They asked Lewis to give a series of radio talks about faith, like on national radio. These talks were a huge hit and put Lewis in the spotlight. They eventually published a book from these talks, the perennial bestseller, Mere Christianity. Lewis honored his pact with More and took care of More's mother and sister until his own death. It's said to have influenced some of his later writings, including the Chronicles of Narnia series, in which themes of sacrifice, loss, and the restoration of love and hope are prominent. With his Narnia books, he has shaped the imaginations of generations of young people. His books, The Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity, are modern masterpieces of Christian philosophy. I'd say a big reason his works and his faith stood the test of time is because he wasn't always a Christian thinker. Lewis spent a good chunk of his life exploring and questioning beliefs before arriving fully to his faith. He'd thoroughly considered every step of his own dramatic conversion. Here's a final quote from his inspiring story.
I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.